A federal judge thought he could intimidate Pam Bondi with legal threats. Little did he know she had spent years preparing for this moment. Her response, so calm yet so devastating, it silenced the courtroom and changed the entire direction of the case. The marble columns of the Fifth Circuit Court stood like ancient sentinels as morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. It was supposed to be a routine hearing, just another day in a high-profile case, but something in the air felt different. Tense, electric, like the moments before a storm. Pam Bondi moved through security, her steps measured, confident, file folders tucked neatly under her arm. She nodded to the officers, who recognized her immediately. Former Attorney General turned special counsel. Her reputation preceded her, a woman who had built her career on precision preparation and unwavering resolve. But today, she faced Judge William Harrington, a man whose reputation was equally known. Appointed during a previous administration, with a judicial record that spoke volumes and a temperament that had broken seasoned attorneys, the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Journalists tapped quietly on laptops. Legal analysts exchanged knowing glances. Everyone sensed this hearing would be different. Judge Harrington had made his opinions clear in previous rulings and public statements. His disdain for Bondi's legal approach barely concealed behind thin veils of judicial propriety. She had challenged one of his most significant decisions, questioned not just the ruling but the reasoning, the kind of legal move that judges remembered, the kind that created enemies in high places. The gallery filled quickly, the air growing thick with perfume, cologne, and the unmistakable scent of anticipation. Some had come to witness a public dressing down, others hoped for a moment of judicial drama. Few expected what would actually unfold. Bondi set her briefcase on the defense table, arranged her papers with practiced precision, her face betraying nothing, but those who knew her well might have noticed the subtle tightening around her eyes, the slight straightening of her shoulders, small signals of a fighter preparing for battle. Across the aisle, opposing counsel, a team of corporate attorneys in tailored suits, exchanged confident smiles and casual whispers. They had the judge on their side, or so they believed. And in this courtroom, that usually meant victory. The clerk's voice cut through the murmurs. All rise. The Honorable Judge William Harrington presiding. The room fell silent as Harrington entered, his robes flowing behind him. Like a shadow, his expression stern as he surveyed the courtroom. His eyes lingered on Bondi. Just a heartbeat too long, a flicker of something passing between them. Not quite hostility, not quite disdain, but recognition. Two powerful forces about to collide. Please be seated, he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came with years on the bench. The rustle of movement filled the room, then faded to expectant silence. We're here today in the matter of Richardson versus Aerotech. The judge began, his tone already edged with impatience. Miss Bondi, I understand you filed yet another motion. He emphasized the word, yet making his frustration clear. Despite my previous ruling on this matter, Bondi rose, her posture impeccable. Yes, Your Honor, we've submitted a motion to reconsider based on new evidence that has come to light. The judge's fingers drummed against the bench, an unmistakable sign of his irritation. Miss Bondi, this court has already dedicated significant time and resources to this case. He looked down at her over his reading glasses, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. Your persistent challenges suggest either a misunderstanding of this court's authority or a deliberate attempt to delay proceedings. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Legal observers exchanged glances. The judge was showing his hand early, setting a tone that bordered on hostile. Bondi remained still, a statue of composure, her voice steady when she responded. Your Honor, with all due respect, our motion is based on recently discovered documents that materially affect the foundation of the case. Harrington leaned forward slightly, his expression darkening perhaps. Counselor, he said, his voice dripping with condescension, you need a refresher on the standards for reconsideration. They aren't simply vehicles for dissatisfied attorneys to take another bite at the apple. Across the room, a journalist scribbled Furiously, another whispered to a colleague this was exactly the confrontation they had anticipated, the powerful judge putting the former ag in her place, a moment of legal theater playing out exactly as expected, but those watching closely might have noticed something unusual in Bondi's demeanor. Not fear, not intimidation, not even the righteous indignation that often fueled attorneys in hostile courtrooms. Instead, there was something calculating in her eyes, a quiet confidence that seemed at odds with her seemingly vulnerable position opposing counsel. Smirked openly, now one leaned to whisper to another, "She's about to get destroyed." Bondi opened. Folder on her table, her movements unhurried. "Deliberate, Your Honor, if I may direct the court's attention to Exhibit C in our filing." But Harrington cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Miss Bondi, I've reviewed your submissions and found them wholly insufficient to merit reconsideration." He picked up a document from his bench, skimmed it with exaggerated disinterest. His next words clearly intended to put an end to what he viewed as a waste of the court's time. "It appears to me that you're attempting to relitigate issues already decided." Perhaps, he added, his voice hardening, "this is a publicity strategy rather than a legal one." The room tensed at the accusation, a direct questioning of her professional integrity, the kind of judicial comment that could make headlines, the kind that lesser attorneys would shrink from. But Bondi didn't flinch, didn't waver. Instead, she straightened almost imperceptibly, her voice remaining measured, respectful, but carrying a new edge of steel. "Your Honor, if I could just clarify the record." The judge cut her off again, his patience visibly thinning. "Ms. Bondi, I don't need clarification. I need you to understand that this court will not be manipulated by theatrical motions or media posturing." He leaned forward, his knuckles white against the polished wood of his bench. "In 20 years on this bench, I have never seen such a blatant attempt to circumvent the clear ruling of this court." Now the room was completely silent, every eye fixed on the confrontation, unfolding the power dynamic crystal clear. A federal judge wielding authority like a weapon against an attorney who appeared to have overreached. Bondi stood perfectly still, the moment stretching out like a wire pulled tight. Those who knew her recognized the look in her eyes, not defeat, not submission, but the calm that comes before a storm. Judge Harrington seemed to sense it too, something in her composure unsettling him, making him push harder. "Perhaps, Miss Bondi," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, "you've confused this federal court with the court of public opinion, where you've spent so much of your career." It was a calculated insult designed to diminish her legal credentials, to frame her as a politician playing attorney. And for a moment, it seemed to work. Opposing counsel couldn't hide their satisfaction. A few spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Journalists furiously documented every word. This was becoming the exact takedown they expected. The judge looked down at his papers, a clear dismissal, a power move intended to establish once and for all who controlled this courtroom. But then, Bondi spoke, her voice calm, clear, unwavering, a single sentence that changed everything. "Your Honor, before you continue, there's something about this case you need to know." The judge looked up, sharply surprised by her interruption, irritation flashing across his face, but something in her tone, something in her absolute certainty, made the room lean forward. Collectively made even Judge Harrington pause. What happened next would stun the courtroom, change the trajectory of the case, and become one of the most referenced moments in recent legal history. Bondi was about to reveal information that would not only challenge the judge's ruling, but would question the very foundation of his understanding of the case. And no one, not even Judge Harrington himself, was prepared for what she was about to say. The courtroom of the Fifth Circuit was more than just a legal venue. It was a monument to authority, with vaulted ceilings stretching overhead, dark wood paneling gleaming under strategic lighting, and the American flag standing solemnly behind the bench as a reminder of what was truly at stake. Judge William Harrington's courtroom had its own particular atmosphere, one crafted over years of his iron-fisted control, where clerks moved with silent efficiency, lawyers spoke in hushed tones before proceedings, and no one laughed or whispered excessively, as the unwritten rules were known to all who entered. This morning, the air felt particularly heavy, weighted with anticipation and something else. Something that made even seasoned attorneys check their notes one extra time, straighten their ties, smooth their skirts, small nervous gestures betraying the tension. Outside, spring sunshine bathed New Orleans, the French Quarter already humming with tourists and street performers setting up for another day. But inside these walls, time moved differently, sealed away from the outside world in the realm of precedent and procedure. Pam Bondi understood this environment instinctively. Having spent decades in rooms just like this one, the few were as openly hostile as this particular court, so she settled her papers, arranging them methodically, each document, each exhibit, each precedent placed within easy reach for what was coming. Across the aisle, opposing counsel, a team from Winters and Mitchell, one of the most powerful firms in corporate law, represented Aerotech with casual confidence. Their lead attorney, James Prescott, leaning back in his chair, occasionally glancing toward Bondi with thinly veiled contempt, while his second chair whispered something that made Prescott smile, a private joke at Bondi's expense perhaps, or confidence in their advantageous position with a judge known to favor corporate interests. The gallery was unusually full for a procedural hearing, as word had spread through legal circles about the brewing conflict between Bondi and Harrington, drawing court watchers and law students who filled the back rows, hungry for a glimpse of legal combat. A court reporter prepared her stenotype, fingers hovering, ready to capture every word, every objection, every ruling, creating the official record that would endure long after memories of this day had faded. The bailiff stood at attention, his presence a reminder that this battlefield, though intellectual, had real guards, real boundaries, and real consequences. The large wooden doors at the back opened as a few latecomers slipped in, including a thin man in a rumpled suit who took a seat in the back corner, his eyes never leaving Bondi Marcus Richardson, the plaintiff whose life had been shattered by Aerotech's actions, for whom this wasn't academic, wasn't career advancement, but his last chance for justice. Bondi sensed his presence without turning, felt the weight of his expectations, all the phone calls, sleepless nights, strategy sessions, and preparation leading to this moment with a man's future hanging in the balance. She had taken the case, when 3 other firms had refused, seeing something in the evidence that others had missed or avoided, a pattern that suggested not just negligence but deliberate deception by Aerotech. As she reviewed her opening notes, she could feel eyes on her from every direction, opposing counsel measuring her resolve, journalists assessing her composure, Judge Harrington watching for any sign of weakness, a room full of people waiting for her to fail. The air conditioning hummed softly, pushing cool air through invisible vents, yet the room felt warm, almost stifling, with collective body heat and tension. Prescott leaned over to whisper to his team, their expensive watches, catching the light as they nodded in practiced unison. A corporate legal army assembled against one woman who dared to challenge their client. The clerk shuffled papers at his station, arranging the day's filings, checking the court calendar, confirming procedures, the machinery of justice moving forward with mechanical precision. Bondi took a small sip of water, leaving no lipstick mark on the glass, her movements deliberate, controlled, revealing nothing of her inner thoughts, her strategy a mystery even to her own client. The judge's chamber door remained closed, but everyone's eyes darted toward it with each sound, each movement, the anticipation building with every passing minute. Harrington was known for his punctuality, a man who expected others to operate on his schedule and made his displeasure known when they didn't. Yet today, he was 3 minutes late, an unusual deviation that added to the tension. Bondi had faced Harrington twice before, each encounter more contentious than the last. Their legal philosophies diametrically opposed, their interpretations of the same precedents leading them to wildly different conclusions. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second bringing them closer to the confrontation that had been building through motions, filings, and terse court orders. Court officers stood at their stations, alert, watchful, maintaining the invisible barrier between the participants and observers. The architecture of the room itself, designed to separate those with power from those who came to witness it. The plaintiff's section remained mostly empty save for Richardson and 2 family members, a visual reminder of the imbalance in this fight. A single family against a corporate giant with billions in annual revenue. Prescott rose briefly to confer. With a colleague, his movements relaxed, almost leisurely, the confidence of a man who believed the judge was already in his corner. The sunlight shifted through the tall windows, creating patterns across the floor, geometric shapes that seemed to point directly at the space where Bondi stood, as if nature itself were highlighting the woman at the center of this legal storm. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down like a physical force, yet her posture remained perfect, her expression neutral, professional years of high stakes. Litigation had taught her that showing emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford. The door to the judge's chambers finally opened, and the room collectively held its breath. The clerk stood immediately, signaling the imminent entrance of Harrington. Bondi took one final glance at her notes, then closed the folder. Her preparation complete, what would happen next would depend not on paper, but on her ability to think on her feet, to anticipate Harrington's hostility and turn it to her advantage. The hush that fell over the room was absolute, as if someone had suddenly muted all ambient sound, leaving only the heavy anticipation of what was about to unfold. From her peripheral vision, Bondi could see journalists poised, pens hovering over notepads, fingers ready over laptop keyboards, preparing to document what many expected to be her professional humiliation. But they didn't know what she knew, hadn't seen what she had discovered in thousands of pages of technical documents buried. Evidence that Aerotech had fought to keep hidden. Evidence that would not only change this case, but potentially dozens of others across the country. Prescott arranged his expensive fountain pen precisely parallel to his legal pad. A man who believed in controlling every detail down to the smallest gesture, unaware that the narrative he had crafted so carefully was about to unravel completely. The bailiff's voice cut through the silence, his traditional announcement ringing out with ceremonial authority as Judge Harrington emerged from his chambers, his robe swirling around him, his expression already set in familiar lines of disapproval. What happened in the next few minutes would not only determine the fate of this case, but would send ripples through the entire legal community, changing perceptions, shifting power dynamics, and revealing truths that powerful interests had spent millions trying to conceal. As Judge Harrington took his seat, adjusting his robes with practiced dignity, no one in that courtroom could have predicted the seismic shift that was about to occur, or how Pam Bondi's next words would transform a routine, hearing into a moment that would be studied in law schools for decades to come. But the stage was set, the players were in position, and the legal battle that many thought was already decided was about to take an unexpected turn. Judge William Harrington settled into his leather chair with the comfortable authority of a man who had occupied that elevated position for 22 years. His silver hair precisely trimmed, his robe spotless and expertly tailored, the perfect image of judicial authority. But those who appeared before him regularly knew to look for the warning signs, the slight tightening at the corners of his mouth, the way his left eyebrow would arch almost imperceptibly when his patience began to fray. And at 67 he had the lean build of someone who still played racquetball twice weekly, and the sharp gaze of a man who rarely missed even the smallest detail. And today that gaze was fixed firmly on Pam Bondi, with the particular intensity he reserved for attorneys he considered troublesome. Born to fourth-generation wealth, educated at Princeton and Yale, his understanding of justice had been shaped by a lifetime of privilege and power, his worldview rarely challenged by those who lacked his pedigree or connections. And to the legal community, he was known as brilliant but rigid, his opinions meticulously crafted, his interpretations of law consistently narrow, and his tolerance for being questioned non-existent. His record of favorable rulings for corporate interests had raised eyebrows among judicial watchdogs, but never quite crossed the line that might trigger formal ethics concerns. And in his mind, he wasn't biased. He was simply protecting the economic engine that had built America, the free market principles he held sacred against what he viewed as frivolous litigation. And across from him, Pam Bondi presented a stark contrast in every possible way. At 54, she carried herself with the confident poise that came not from inherited position, but from fighting her way through male-dominated rooms for over 3 decades. Her tailored navy suit was expensive but understated, her blonde hair cut in a practical style that required minimal maintenance. A woman focused on substance over appearance, though she understood the importance of both. The daughter of a Florida schoolteacher and a mayor, she had climbed through state politics to become Florida's first female attorney general before returning to private practice, where she selectively took on cases that aligned with her personal sense of justice. Her legal approach was methodical, relentless, built on exhaustive research and preparation. She knew that as a woman she would be held to a higher standard, given less room for error, afforded less respect by default, so she had learned to be twice as prepared, twice as precise, twice as persuasive, leaving no detail unchecked, no argument unpracticed, no scenario unconsidered. And the press had often labeled her as cold, calculating, but those who knew her understood. This was armor developed through necessity, protection against a system that would use any vulnerability against her. And today she wore that armor polished to perfection, her expression revealing nothing, her posture relaxed but alert like a fighter waiting for the opening bell. And between these two opposing forces sat James Prescott, Aerotech's lead counsel, a man whose $1,200 shoes and Patek Philippe watch announced his status more loudly than words ever could. At 48, he had already made partner at one of the nation's most prestigious firms. His specialty was making problematic cases disappear through procedural maneuvers and aggressive tactics that wore down opponents without ever reaching trial. He leaned back in his chair with manufactured ease, occasionally glancing at his phone as if this hearing were merely an inconvenience in his otherwise important day. But those who knew him well might have noticed the tight grip on his pen, the occasional glance toward his junior associates, signs that beneath his confident exterior lurked something less certain. And his team flanked him like expensive accessories. 5 associates, each billing $500 an hour to sit and occasionally hand him documents or whisper observations in his ear. This wasn't just legal representation. It was a show of force, Aerotech sending a message about the resources they were willing to deploy to bury this case once and for all. And in the back of the courtroom, Marcus Richardson sat completely still, his thin frame seeming to disappear into the polished wooden bench. Once a senior engineer at Aerotech with a promising career and growing family, now he was almost unrecognizable. His face gaunt, his eyes hollow, his shoulders perpetually hunched as if permanently bent under invisible weight. 3 years ago, he had discovered testing data that had been altered, safety reports that had been falsified, warnings that had been ignored. And when he raised concerns internally, he was first ignored, then marginalized, finally terminated under the pretense of budget cuts and restructuring. Weeks later, when he took his evidence to federal regulators, Aerotech's legal machinery had activated, targeting him with lawsuits for breaching confidentiality, for stealing company property, for defamation. The financial burden had crushed him, his savings depleted, his house foreclosed. his marriage crumbling under the strain. 4 lawyers had turned him away before Pam Bondi had agreed to hear his story in a meeting that stretched from 1 hour to nearly 5 as she reviewed his documents, asked precise questions, and finally looked him in the eye and said simply, "I believe you." And now he watched her from across the courtroom, his entire future resting on her ability to overcome not just Aerotech's legal team, but the hostile judge who seemed determined to bury the case without a trial. And scattered throughout the gallery, journalists from various legal publications sat with notebooks or laptops, each with their own angle on the proceedings. Rebecca Chun from Legal Affairs, known for her technical expertise and attention to detail. Marcus Watkins from Corporate Counsel, who typically favored business interests and had already written a piece questioning Bondi's motives in taking the case. Sarah Cohen from the Justice Report, whose previous articles had been critical of Judge Harrington's pro-corporate rulings. They represented the public's eyes and ears in a proceeding that would otherwise remain hidden behind courthouse walls. And the court reporter Diane Miller had served in Harrington's courtroom for over a decade, her fingers poised over a stenotype machine, her expression professionally neutral, though she had witnessed countless attorneys wilt under Harrington's withering questioning. She had seen Bondi stand her ground before in ways that few others dared, and wondered privately if today would finally push the judge too far. And the clerk, Thomas Jefferson Washington, a name that had prompted jokes throughout his life, sat to the judge's right, his movements efficient, his manner subdued. After 15 years in this courtroom, he had mastered the art of invisibility, of anticipating the judge's needs before they were expressed. And the 2 court officers stood at attention. Keith Martinez, a 20-year veteran whose expression never changed regardless of proceedings, and Janelle Williams, newer to the role but equally professional in her demeanor. They had witnessed every type of courtroom drama, from tearful breakdowns to angry outbursts, and knew from experience that the most explosive moments often came from the quietest beginnings. And as Judge Harrington reviewed the docket, the room settled into watchful silence, each person playing their assigned role in this carefully choreographed legal theater. But Pam Bondi was about to change the script, introducing elements that none of them, not even the ever-prepared Judge Harrington, had anticipated. She stood at the plaintiff's table, a single figure against the imposing machinery of corporate legal power, her expression betraying nothing of the knowledge she carried. Like ammunition, what no one in the room yet realized was that this wasn't just another hearing, another procedural skirmish in a long legal war. This was the moment when everything would change, when carefully constructed narratives would collapse, when truth would finally emerge from beneath layers of legal maneuvering. The judge looked up from his papers, his gaze sharp, assessing, meeting Bondi's steady eyes across the courtroom in a silent clash of wills that everyone present could feel. And the next word spoken would determine not just the direction of this case, but potentially the future of Aerotech itself and the fate of dozens of families affected by decisions made in corporate boardrooms where profit had trumped safety, where lives had been calculated as acceptable losses. The stage was set, the characters assembled, the tension building toward an inevitable collision of opposing forces that would leave nothing unchanged in its wake. Judge Harrington cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the silence like a warning shot before battle. "The matter before us today," he began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who had presided over thousands of hearings, concerns a motion to reconsider filed by counsel for the plaintiff. He looked down at the papers before him. Though everyone knew he had memorized the details, a power move to make Bondi wait and establish that his time was valuable and hers was not. This court has already ruled on the admissibility of the evidence in question and found it fails to meet the standard for relevance under Federal Rule 401. His eyes lifted to Bondi, the challenge in them unmistakable. "Yet here we are again, Miss Bondi. with what appears to be a thinly disguised attempt to relitigate issues already decided. Bondi rose, moving with deliberate calm, her hands resting lightly on the table before her. "Your Honor, if I may," she began, her voice steady, respectful but with an underlying firmness that made several observers sit up straighter. "Our motion is not a request to relitigate, but to introduce new evidence that directly bears on the admissibility issue." Harrington's expression tightened imperceptibly, the slight narrowing of his eyes the only indication of his growing irritation. "Ms. Bondi, we've been through this. The discovery period closed 3 months ago. The rules of procedure exist for a reason." Bondi nodded, acknowledging his point. A tactical concession before her counter. "I understand, Your Honor, and under normal circumstances, I would never ask the court to consider evidence outside the discovery window." Prescott shifted in his seat, leaning forward slightly, sensing something unexpected in her approach. "But these are not normal circumstances," Bondi continued, keeping her tone measured. "This evidence was deliberately withheld by the defendants during discovery." A murmur rippled through the gallery, quickly silenced by a sharp look from the judge. "That's a serious accusation, counsel," he said, his voice hardening. "One I presume you can substantiate." Prescott was on his feet before Bondi could respond, his controlled demeanor slipping just enough to reveal the first hints of concern. "Your Honor, this is outrageous," he said with practiced indignation. "Counsel is making unfounded allegations against my clients and my firm without a shred of evidence." Bondi didn't acknowledge him, keeping her focus entirely on the judge. A veteran's strategy, knowing that engaging directly with opposing counsel would diminish her position. "Your Honor, I wouldn't bring this to the court without substantial proof." She reached for a folder on her table, the blue cover unmarked except for a case number. But the way she handled it suggested its contents were significant. Judge Harrington hesitated, visibly torn between his inclination to shut down Bondi's argument and his judicial obligation to at least hear her evidence of potential discovery violations. "Ms. Bondi," he said finally, "you have exactly 3 minutes to explain why this plea and why this court should even consider reopening a matter that has been decided." It was less time than she deserved, but more than he wanted to give her. And everyone in the courtroom knew it. Bondi opened the folder, removing a single document, its pages thick with technical specifications and corporate letterhead. "2 weeks ago," she began, "my office received an anonymous package containing internal Aerotech communications that were responsive to our discovery requests, but were never produced." She held up the document just high enough for the judge to see the Aerotech logo, but not close enough for him to read its contents, a subtle maneuver forcing him to ask for it or admit he wasn't interested in potential evidence. Prescott's jaw visibly tightened, his right hand forming a fist beneath the table as his junior associate whispered something urgent that made his expression darken further. Judge Harrington's patience visibly thinned. "Miss Bondi, anonymous packages. Convenient timing. These sound like the desperate tactics of a failing case." The dismissal in his tone was unmistakable. But Bondi didn't flinch, didn't waver. "I understand your skepticism, Your Honor, which is why we took extraordinary steps to authenticate these documents." She removed a second paper from her folder, the letterhead of a respected digital forensics firm visible even from the judge's bench. "We engaged cybertech forensics to verify the metadata, timestamps, and digital signatures. Their analysis confirms these documents originated from Aerotech servers between 2018 and 2020. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers and shifting in seats had stopped, all eyes moving between Bondi and the judge as the gravity of her claim sank in. Prescott was on his feet again, this time his calm facade crumbling noticeably. "Your Honor, this is procedurally improper. Counsel should have approached us directly if she believed there were discovery issues." His voice carried a new edge. The first hint of genuine concern, not the manufactured outrage of before Judge Harrington raised a hand, silencing Prescott. Without looking at him, his full attention now on Bondi, his expression a complex mixture of skepticism, judicial concern, and something else harder to define, even if these documents are authentic, Ms. Bondi. And I'm not conceding that they are. You haven't established their relevance to your motion to reconsider. It was a procedural dodge, a way to acknowledge the serious allegation while still maintaining his position against reopening the case. Bondi nodded as if she had anticipated exactly this response. Reaching into the folder for a third document, this one thicker than the others, bound with a heavy clip. Your Honor, these communications reveal that Aerotech executives were explicitly aware of the safety issues that Mr. Richardson reported. In fact, they document multiple test failures and engineering concerns that directly contradict the sworn testimony of CEO Michael Thornton. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the implication became clear. She was alleging not just discovery violations, but potential perjury by Aerotech's chief executive. Prescott's team was now in visible disarray. Associates furiously writing notes, passing messages back and forth, one pulling out his phone despite courtroom rules against electronic communications. Judge Harrington's expression had become unreadable. Years of judicial discipline preventing him from revealing his thoughts as the case suddenly shifted beneath him. The slight tapping of his fingers against the bench betrayed his internal calculation, the weighing of his previous rulings against this new, potentially explosive information. Ms. Bondi, he said finally, his voice more measured than before. You understand that allegations of this nature require more than just documents of questionable provenance. It was a test, a challenge to see how far she was willing to go, how much she had actually discovered. Bondi met his gaze directly, unflinching, unwavering. Yes, Your Honor, I do understand. Which is why Exhibit C includes emails directly from Mr. Thornton explicitly ordering his team to, and I quote, sanitize the reports before they go to legal and make sure nothing contradicts our official position on the safety protocols. A sharp intake of breath came from the Aerotech table, followed by urgent whispers and the sound of papers being frantically reviewed in the gallery. Journalists were scribbling furiously, court watchers leaning forward in their seats, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Judge Harrington's expression darkened, not with anger at Bondi, but with the dawning recognition that this hearing had just become significantly more complicated. If what you're alleging is true, Ms. Bondi, then why bring it as a motion to reconsider rather than a motion for sanctions for discovery violations? It was a legitimate question, but also a probe, testing her strategy. Her ultimate objective. Bondi's response came without hesitation, her voice steady but carrying new weight. Because, Your Honor, this isn't just about procedural violations or even perjury. It's about the fundamental facts of the case. These documents directly address the very evidence you ruled inadmissible, proving its relevance and materiality. She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering the final thrust. And more importantly, they reveal that Aerotech knowingly placed thousands of consumers at risk, including the 12 families who have already suffered losses. The stakes were now crystal clear. This wasn't just about one whistleblower, one corporation, or one case. It was about public safety, corporate accountability, and the integrity of the judicial process itself. Prescott rose to his feet, straightening his custom suit jacket, a practiced move designed to project confidence, but his fingers betrayed him, tapping an irregular rhythm against his legal pad. Your Honor, he began, his voice lacking its usual smoothness. These allegations are not just unsubstantiated, they're preposterous. And as he glanced toward his team, who was still frantically reviewing documents with faces tight with growing concern, he continued, Aerotech has fully complied with all discovery obligations. and Ms. Bondi's theatrical presentation of supposedly anonymous documents conveniently appearing at the 11th hour should be seen for what it is. Then he paused, letting a thin smile form, a desperate attempt to salvage both his position and his composure, before adding, a transparent attempt to keep alive a case that lacks merit. But Judge Harrington, nodding slightly more from habit than agreement, kept his eyes fixed on the blue folder Bondi still held at her table and turned to her, his expression hardening. "Miss Bondi, I hope you appreciate the seriousness of accusing counsel of discovery violations," his tone carrying a warning, a reminder of the professional consequences that would follow if her claims proved baseless. Yet Bondi stood her ground, neither defensive nor aggressive, simply certain, "I do, Your Honor," which is why I have prepared a detailed affidavit from the forensic expert who authenticated these documents, she said as she removed another paper from her folder and approached the bench, placing it before the judge, who glanced at it, his expression unchanging, though his eyes lingered on certain passages, suggesting the contents were significant. Then she continued, "I have also submitted under seal the full technical report detailing the chain of custody and authentication methodology." Her voice remaining steady, professional, but with a slight emphasis on chain of custody, a deliberate, pointed reminder that she had followed proper procedure, causing Judge Harrington to lean back in his chair, fingers forming a steeple beneath his chin, a gesture court regulars recognized as a sign he was reassessing his position. Then he said, "Miss Bondi, while these allegations are serious, they remain just that, allegations. You have yet to convince me that they warrant reopening a decided matter. A test, a final chance for her to either retreat or commit fully." And Bondi didn't hesitate. "Your Honor, with respect, this is no longer simply about my client's whistleblower claims," her voice taking on a new edge, steel beneath the professional veneer. "This evidence suggests Aerotech knowingly concealed critical safety data not just from this court, but from federal regulators," she continued as she removed a final document from her folder, this one bearing government letterhead. "I've taken the liberty of notifying the Consumer Product Safety Commission of our findings," and the courtroom erupted in whispers, even the court reporter pausing, momentarily stunned by the escalation, while Prescott slammed his hand on the table, the sound cracking through the room like a gunshot. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. Ms. Bondi has no authority to contact regulators with unsubstantiated claims. This is nothing short of an attempt to pressure the court through external means," his voice losing all pretense of control, raw anger breaking through his professional facade. But Bondi remained unmoved, her calm in stark contrast to his outburst. "I have not just the authority, Mr. Prescott, but the ethical obligation to report evidence of public safety concerns to the appropriate regulatory bodies," she said as she turned back to the judge, her expression solemn. "Your Honor, this case has always been about more than one man's career. It's about corporate accountability and the safety of American consumers." And while Judge Harrington's expression darkened, it was not in the way many expected. There was something new in his eyes. Not anger at Bondi's boldness, but a deeper concern about the implications of what she was revealing. So he finally said, his voice carrying the full weight of his judicial authority, "Miss Bondi, you've made serious allegations here today. Allegations that, if proven, would indeed justify reconsideration." Pausing, choosing his next words carefully, aware that every syllable would be analyzed, dissected, and potentially appealed. "However, I am not prepared to rule on speculative evidence, no matter how troubling it may appear." And the gallery tensed collectively, sensing that Bondi's gambit had failed, that the judge was closing the door she had fought so hard to open. But then Judge Harrington continued, "Which is why I am ordering an emergency evidentiary hearing to be held in my chambers immediately, with counsel for both parties," a pronouncement that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. an extraordinary measure signaling the gravity with which he suddenly viewed the situation. And Prescott was on his feet again, this time his panic barely concealed. "Your Honor, surely this matter can be briefed properly, with adequate time for response and consideration." His words rushed together, a man desperately trying to buy time. Yet Bondi's expression didn't change, but there was a new light in her eyes, recognition that the first barrier had fallen, while Judge Harrington's response was swift and left no room for argument. "Mr. Prescott, if these documents are indeed fabricated or irrelevant, as you suggest, then a brief hearing should resolve the matter quickly," his tone hardening. "But if there is any merit to Ms. Bondi's allegations, then the interests of justice require immediate attention." Then he stood, signaling the end of the public portion of the proceedings. "This court will recess for 1 hour, after which I expect both counsel in my chambers with only their essential evidence and no more than one associate each." And then turning to the clerk, "Clear the courtroom, please," as the gallery reluctantly began to empty, journalists lingering as long as possible, hoping to catch any additional details. Prescott leaned toward his team, his expression thunderous, whispered instructions flying between them like frantic birds before a storm. But across the aisle, Bondi remained standing, perfectly still, the eye of the hurricane gathering around her, until Judge Harrington paused at the door to his chambers. Looking back, his gaze moving from Prescott to Bondi, and in that moment, something passed between them, an unspoken recognition that the battle lines had been fundamentally redrawn as the judge disappeared into his chambers. Prescott approached Bondi, his voice low, tightly controlled, but vibrating with barely contained fury. "You've made a serious mistake today. Counselor, one that will have consequences far beyond this courtroom." But Bondi met his gaze directly, neither intimidated nor triumphant, simply resolved. "The only mistake, Mr. Prescott, was assuming that the truth would never come to light," she said as she gathered her documents carefully, methodically, like a surgeon preparing instruments. "Your client had multiple opportunities to do the right thing. Now they'll face the consequences of the choices they made." And Prescott leaned closer, his next words barely audible, a threat wrapped in legal terminology. "This isn't over. There are interests at stake here that you can't possibly understand." But Bondi simply nodded, as if he had confirmed something she already knew. "That, Mr. Prescott, is precisely the problem. And now, with the courtroom nearly empty, only the essential personnel remaining as both attorneys, prepared for the private hearing that would determine not just the fate of this case, but potentially the future of Aerotech itself, Richardson approached Bondi, his thin frame seeming smaller. "In the vast emptiness of the courtroom, what happens now?" he asked, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had been fighting too long. And Bondi placed a steadying hand on his arm, the gesture brief but reassuring. Now they can't hide anymore, because it wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was the beginning of one, the first crack in a wall that had seemed impenetrable. And as they gathered their materials, preparing for the next phase of the battle, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted from the heavy tension of anticipated defeat to something lighter, more dangerous, the electric uncertainty that comes when truth finally begins to emerge. While Prescott watched them from across the room, his expression unreadable, but his posture changed, the confident swagger replaced by something more defensive. A man suddenly forced to play a game he hadn't prepared for. When Judge Harrington's clerk appeared at the chamber door, his expression carefully neutral. "The judge will see you now," the words hanging in the air, simple but weighted with significance. As both attorneys moved toward the chambers, where behind closed doors, the real confrontation was about to begin, but only one of them truly understood what waited on the other side. Judge Harrington's chambers were nothing like the imposing courtroom outside. Dark wood paneling lined the walls. Law books filled built-in shelves, and framed diplomas and awards hung in perfect alignment. creating the impression of a scholarly retreat. He sat behind his massive desk, a fortress of polished mahogany, his robes exchanged for a crisp white shirt, his judicial demeanor intact but somehow more human in this private setting as Bondi and Prescott took their seats on opposite sides of a conference table, their single associates flanking them like seconds in an old-fashioned duel. The air thick with tension, the quiet hum of the climate control the only sound for several long moments before Judge Harrington's eyes moved between them, assessing, calculating, weighing the expressions of two seasoned attorneys who had navigated hundreds of cases, but perhaps none quite like this. As he finally laid both hands flat on his desk and addressed Bondi, "You've made extraordinary claims. Now, I need extraordinary proof." The challenge hanging in the air like a gauntlet thrown down for her to retrieve or retreat from entirely. But Bondi, unwavering, opened her briefcase, removing a USB drive sealed in an evidence bag along with a thick stack of printed documents. Her voice steady but carrying a new gravity as she stated, "Your Honor, these files contain communications between Aerotech CEO Michael Thornton, their head of product safety James Wilson, and their chief counsel David Blackwell," placing the USB drive on his desk with deliberate care, as if handling evidence rather than exhibits, explaining that they spanned a period of 18 months. Leading up to and following Mr. Richardson's termination, prompting Prescott to lean forward, jaw tight, objecting with a mix of professional indignation and a hint of genuine concern. "Your Honor, we haven't been provided with copies of these alleged documents and have no way to verify their authenticity or respond to their contents." But even here in the judge's chambers, his usual controlled demeanor cracked ever so slightly as Bondi, undeterred, countered, "I understand Mr. Prescott's concerns, which is why I've brought complete copies for both the court and opposing counsel," passing a bound stack to Prescott, who accepted it with visible reluctance before adding, "And I've prepared a chain of custody declaration from the forensic expert who authenticated them." As Judge Harrington took the USB drive, turning it in his fingers contemplatively, the small object seemingly insignificant yet potentially devastating, and its implications before he asked, "These alleged emails, Ms. Bondi, how did they come into your possession?" The question she had been waiting for, the moment around which everything else pivoted, and instead of answering immediately, she removed a sealed envelope from her briefcase and handed it to the judge, stating, "This is a sworn affidavit from Sarah Geller, Aerotech's former head of data security," the name landing like a thunderclap in the room as Prescott's head snapped up, his expression shifting from concern to alarm, and as Bondi continued, revealing that Geller had been terminated last month after raising concerns about improper data handling and had retained copies of the communications as part of her job responsibilities before providing them to Bondi's office. Prescott shot to his feet, his composure fracturing completely, his voice rising beyond professional levels. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. Sarah Geller was terminated for cause after multiple security violations and is currently under investigation for corporate espionage." His indignation barely masking his growing panic as he accused Bondi of accepting stolen corporate property and demanded the documents be excluded. But Judge Harrington raised a hand, silencing him mid-tirade with a simple but firm, "Sit down. Mr. Prescott, your objection is noted." The words carrying a weight that left no room for argument as Prescott sank back into his chair, his breathing audible in the quiet room, while the judge turned his attention back to the USB drive and affidavit, stating neutrally, "I will review these materials and determine their admissibility," before turning to Bondi, his expression hardening. "But be advised, Miss Bondi, if these documents prove to be fabricated or illegally obtained, the consequences will be severe. Not a threat, but a promise, a reminder that judicial patience had limits." Yet Bondi met his gaze without fear or hesitation, responding, "I understand, Your Honor, and I would expect nothing less," before continuing, a voice taking on a new tone, not argumentative, but resolute. But these documents will show that Aerotech executives not only knew about the safety defects Mr. Richardson reported, but actively concealed them from regulators, customers, and this court. Flipping to a marked page, her words cutting through the room as she read, "This email from CEO Thornton, dated March 15, 2019, specifically instructs his team to," and I quote, "make sure none of Richardson's findings appear in the final safety report. We can't afford another recall," as Judge Harrington's expression remained unreadable, though his eyes moved to Prescott, watching his reaction. The opposing attorney's face paling slightly, his right hand curling into a fist beneath the table, while his associate frantically flipped through their copy of the documents. But Bondi pressed on relentlessly. "I would direct the court's attention to Exhibit 14, page 27, an email chain between Mr. Thornton and Aerotech's legal department discussing," and again I quote, "what to withhold from discovery to keep Richardson's case from gaining traction." Each word precise. Each document strategically selected to build not just a legal argument, but a narrative of deliberate deception. Her voice lowering but intensifying as she declared, "Your Honor, this isn't just about discovery violations or perjury, though both have clearly occurred. This is about a corporate culture that prioritized profits over human safety, that silenced whistleblowers and deliberately misled this court." As Judge Harrington studied the documents, his judicial mask slipping just enough to reveal a growing concern that transcended his previous dismissiveness. Before he finally addressed Prescott, "Mr. Prescott, these appear to be authentic corporate communications with proper headers, metadata, and signatures. Not a question but a statement, an opportunity for response that suddenly felt inadequate." And as Prescott cleared his throat, his confident demeanor visibly strained, he attempted to stall. "Your Honor, without time to properly review and authenticate these alleged documents, I cannot offer a substantive response." The words weak, buying time without conviction. Before adding, however, I would point out that communications can be taken out of context, and what may appear damaging often has innocent explanations when properly understood. But the excuse was flimsy, and Judge Harrington's expression hardened as he countered, "And what innocent explanation, Mr. Prescott, would you offer for your client's instruction to purge all emails related to the failed safety tests before they can be discovered?" His voice carrying an edge of anger that few had ever heard from him, following up with, or perhaps their discussion about keeping Richardson's concerns internal since public disclosure would tank the stock. As Prescott paled visibly, trapped between his duty to defend his client and the impossibility of defending the indefensible, while the judge inserted the USB drive into his computer, his expression growing grimmer with each document he opened, the silence stretching, broken only by the soft clicks of his mouse and the increasingly agitated breathing of Aerotech's legal team, until after several minutes that felt like hours, he removed the drive and folded his hands on the desk before him, his voice final and weighty as he declared, "Miss Bondi, I find your evidence compelling enough to warrant immediate action." The pronouncement landing like a physical force in the room as Bondi straightened ever so slightly while Prescott seemed to shrink in his chair, and as the judge continued, reopening Richardson v. Aerotech and ordering a full evidentiary hearing on all previously excluded evidence. Prescott moved to object but was cut off by a raised hand as the judge escalated further, ordering Aerotech to produce all communications related to the safety issues within 48 hours and referring the matter to the Department of Justice for investigation of potential criminal violations including obstruction of justice, perjury, and fraud. The pronouncement a seismic shift in a case that had seemed all but closed just hours before. And as Judge Harrington stood, concluding the private hearing with words that carried a weight extending beyond this chamber, he reminded Prescott, "The law may move slowly, Mr. Prescott, but it does move. And those who attempt to obstruct it eventually face consequences. As outside in the corridor, Richardson waited, his thin face lined with worry, years of disappointment, making him cautious even in the face of potential vindication. But when Bondi emerged, her expression told him everything he needed to know, and as she simply stated, the judge reopened the case and referred it to the DOJ. Richardson's eyes widened, tears forming, his voice breaking as he whispered, "They can't bury it anymore," to which Bondi nodded, her professional reserve softening just slightly, replying, "No, they can't." As they walked toward the elevator, passing Prescott, who emerged looking ashen, his steps unsteady, his team trailing behind like survivors of an unexpected disaster, his eyes meeting Bondi's with a mix of anger, fear, and grudging respect, his words hollow as he muttered, "This isn't over." But Bondi didn't need to respond. The reversal was complete. The tables had turned, the powerful had been revealed as vulnerable, and justice, long delayed, was finally within reach. As the courtroom doors opened, whispers spread like wildfire. Journalists who had been waiting in the corridor leaned forward collectively, notebooks poised, pens ready. No one knew exactly what had transpired behind the closed doors of the judge's chambers, but the expressions of those emerging told a story more eloquent than words. Prescott emerged first, his confident stride replaced by stiff, mechanical movements, his face drawn tight as a drumskin. The color drained from his features, his team followed looking shell-shocked, folders clutched too tightly against their chests, eyes avoiding the questioning gazes of the assembled press corps, the body language unmistakable. This wasn't a legal team celebrating victory. These were survivors of an unexpected catastrophe, retreating to assess the damage. The journalists sensed it immediately, the scent of a story changing direction. Like predators detecting wounded prey, they moved toward Prescott, questions already forming on their lips. "Mr. Prescott, any comment on the judge's decision?" The words tumbled over each other. A barrage of inquiries met with silence. Prescott pushed past them, his only response a terse, "No comment at this time." The standard refuge of attorneys facing unexpected defeat. Behind him came Pam Bondi, her posture unchanged, her expression composed. But those who looked closely might have noticed the slight lift at the corners of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the quiet satisfaction of a long-fought battle finally turning. "Ms. Bondi, can you confirm the judge has reopened the case? Has there been a settlement discussion? What evidence changed his mind?" She paused, meeting their eager gazes with practiced, professional restraint. "The court will issue its formal ruling shortly," she said, her voice steady, measured. "I can only confirm that Judge Harrington has ordered an evidentiary hearing and referred certain matters to the Department of Justice." The statement, though limited, sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Judge involvement meant this had escalated beyond a simple civil proceeding into something potentially criminal. Marcus Richardson emerged last, still thin, still haunted, but standing straighter than before, as if a weight had been partially lifted from his bent shoulders. The crowd parted instinctively, recognizing the man at the center of this legal tempest, many seeing him not as a plaintiff, but as a person for the first time. "Mr. Richardson, how do you feel about today's developments?" A young reporter called out, thrusting a recorder toward him. Richardson hesitated, looked to Bondi, who nodded slightly, giving him permission to speak. He cleared his throat, the sound fragile in the marble-lined corridor. "I feel heard," he said finally, his voice gaining strength with each word. "For 3 years, I've been trying to tell the truth about what Aerotech knew and when they knew it. Today, someone finally listened. The simplicity of his statement, its raw emotional honesty, cut through the legal complexities, reminding everyone present that beneath the motions and arguments was a human story of one man's stand against corporate power. Across the hall, the elevator doors opened, revealing Sarah Cohen from Justice Report, who had somehow learned of the chamber's hearing and arrived just in time to witness its aftermath. She approached Bondi directly, bypassing the general scrum. "Sarah." "Cohen, Justice Report. Is it true Judge Harrington has referred Aerotech executives for criminal investigation?" The question silenced the other journalists. All eyes and ears suddenly focused on Bondi's measured response. "I can confirm the judge expressed serious concerns about potential discovery violations and witness testimony, but the specifics of any referral would come from the court, not counsel." It was a careful answer, revealing enough to confirm the story without overstepping ethical boundaries. Cohen pressed further. "Sources tell me evidence emerged today showing Aerotech executives knowingly concealed critical safety data from regulators. Can you confirm?" Bondi's expression remained neutral, but her eyes flickered briefly to Richardson, a silent communication passing between them. "I can only say that significant new evidence was presented to the court today. Evidence that raised serious questions about Aerotech's previous representations." Across the corridor, Prescott stood frozen, his phone pressed to his ear, his face growing increasingly pale as he presumably delivered the devastating news to Aerotech's executive team. Someone had already alerted the financial press, as evidenced by a young man furiously typing on his phone, whispering, "Stock is already down 3 points and trading volume is spiking." The ripple effects were beginning, spreading outward from this courthouse to corporate boardrooms, trading floors, and eventually to the homes of those whose lives had been affected by Aerotech's products and policies. Court officers maintained a respectable distance but watched the unfolding scene with interest. Even they, seasoned by years of legal drama, recognized that something unusual was transpiring in their domain. The clerk emerged brief from the courtroom, his typically impassive expression betraying hints of astonishment as he announced to no one in particular that the court would issue a written order by the end of the day. For those who understood legal procedure, this unprecedented speed only confirmed the gravity of what had occurred behind those closed chamber doors. Rebecca Chun from Legal Affairs, who had witnessed hundreds of similar proceedings, pulled a colleague aside, whispering, "I've never seen Harrington reverse himself like this. Something earth-shattering must have happened in there." Her colleague nodded, adding, "Prescott looks like he's seen a ghost. Aerotech is in serious trouble." As if summoned by their whispers, Prescott finally ended his call, his normally confident demeanor replaced by something approaching panic as he gestured frantically to his team, gathering them for what appeared to be an emergency strategy session. They huddled in the corner of the corridor, voices low, urgent, stressed, occasional phrases floating across the space. Impossible timeline. Need to inform the board. Potential liability. Significant exposure, words that painted a picture of a legal defense crumbling in real time. Bondi watched them briefly, no triumph in her expression, only the quiet satisfaction of justice finally finding its path. "Ms. Bondi," a reporter called. "This must feel like vindication after the judge's earlier hostility." She turned, considering her response carefully. "I don't view legal proceedings in terms of personal victory or defeat." She glanced toward Richardson, who stood slightly apart from the crowd, his eyes fixed on some distant point. "This case has always been about the truth and ensuring that corporations are held to the same standards as the individuals they employ." The statement rippled through the assembled press, several nodding in appreciation of its understated power. Marcus Richardson approached her then, extending his hand in a gesture that seemed inadequate for the moment, yet deeply meaningful in its simplicity. "Thank you," he said softly, "for believing me when no one else would." Bondi took his hand briefly, the professional distance she maintained softening just for a moment. "You did the hard part, Mr. Richardson. You told the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent." Around them, the energy in the corridor continued to shift and pulse, journalists breaking into smaller groups, some rushing to file initial reports, others making calls to editors, all sensing that this story was about to explode beyond the confines of legal reporting into national news. Across the hall, Prescott ended his huddle, his team dispersing with urgent purpose. Several heading for the exits, others pulling out phones, emergency plans clearly activating. Prescott himself stood alone for a moment, his gaze finding Bondi. Across the crowded space, their eyes meeting in silent acknowledgement of a battle decisively turned. He approached her not with anger, but with the grudging respect of one professional for another. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his words lacking the conviction they might have carried hours earlier. Bondi nodded, neither gloating nor dismissive, simply certain. "It never is, Mr. Prescott. But the truth has a way of emerging, no matter how deep it's buried." As he turned to leave, the journalist parted, sensing the significance of this brief exchange, the symbolic concession of a first round in what would likely become a protracted legal war. But the momentum had shifted decisively. The David in this battle suddenly armed with evidence that even Goliath couldn't ignore. As the corridor began to clear, the initial shock giving way to action, Bondi turned to Richardson. "We have work to do," she said simply. "This is just the beginning." He nodded, his expression a complex mixture of exhaustion, relief, and determination, the face of a man who had carried a burden for far too long and could finally see the possibility of setting it down. The courthouse would empty soon, returning to its usual rhythms and procedures. But nothing would be the same for Aerotech, for Richardson, for the legal system that had nearly failed him, or for Pam Bondi, whose quiet persistence had created the first crack in what had seemed an impenetrable wall of corporate power. But the real storm was just beginning to gather force. By sunset, the news had spread far beyond the courthouse walls. Aerotech stock had plummeted 12%. Trading briefly halted after triggering circuit breakers, as investors scrambled to understand the sudden legal crisis engulfing the company. Financial analysts who had long praised Aerotech's impressive profit margins now questioned whether those returns had come at the expense of consumer safety. CNBC ran an urgent breaking segment, the anchor's voice tense with barely contained excitement as she outlined the dramatic courtroom reversal and its potential implications for one of the market's favorite tech darlings. Major shareholders were reportedly demanding emergency meetings with the board of directors. Institutional investors issuing carefully worded statements expressing concern about governance and oversight. The company's PR team released a terse message stating only that Aerotech took all allegations seriously and remained committed to product safety and legal compliance. But the carefully crafted corporate language rang hollow against the specific allegations, now spreading through media channels at Aerotech headquarters in Silicon Valley. Lights burned late into the evening. Executives and legal teams huddled in crisis mode as they grappled with Judge Harrington's order to produce all relevant communications within 48 hours. CEO Michael Thornton had reportedly canceled a keynote speech at a prestigious tech conference, his sudden unavailability fueling speculation about his future with the company. Corporate communications experts already questioned whether he could survive the scandal, particularly if his sworn testimony had indeed been contradicted by internal documents. Meanwhile, in a modest law office 10 blocks from the federal courthouse, Pam Bondi and her small team worked tirelessly, prepared for the onslaught they knew was coming. "We need to be ready," she told her associates. "Aerotech will bring everything they have. Their legal resources are practically unlimited, and they're fighting for survival now." Her senior associate Adam Chen nodded, sliding another document into the growing file. "They'll try to discredit the emails, claim they were taken out of context, or argue they reflect preliminary discussions, not final decisions." Bondi smiled faintly. "They can try, but the timestamps don't lie, and Thornton's signature is on the critical documents." Across town in a hotel conference room hastily converted into a war room, Prescott and an expanded legal team strategized their counterattack damage control options scrolled across a whiteboard, each looking more desperate than the last challenge: authentication of the documents, claim executive privilege, argue improper acquisition of corporate materials, seek disqualification of Judge Harrington, file for change of venue. A junior partner voiced what everyone was thinking. The documents appear legitimate. We need to prepare for the possibility that we can't make this go away. Prescott's expression hardened at the suggestion. There's always a way to manage litigation. We just haven't found it yet. But his voice lacked its usual certainty, the confidence of countless legal victories replaced by the dawning recognition that some battles cannot be won through legal maneuvering alone. On social media, the story gained momentum. #ArrowTechOvarub trending nationwide as consumers began sharing stories of product failures and safety concerns that suddenly seemed part of a larger pattern. Tech journalists who had long celebrated ArrowTech's innovative product line now scrutinized past interviews and press releases, finding carefully worded statements that avoided direct safety questions. Consumer advocacy groups issued statements calling for congressional investigations and expanded regulatory oversight of the entire industry. Sarah Cohen's detailed article in Justice Report, published just 3 hours after the hearing, laid out the case in damning specificity, citing sources familiar with the evidence who confirmed that ArrowTech executives had deliberately concealed safety concerns to avoid costly recalls and regulatory penalties. The piece was shared over 50,000 times in the first hour after publication, each share expanding the blast radius of what had begun as a single whistleblower's claim. In his small apartment, Marcus Richardson sat alone at his kitchen table, watching the story unfold on his laptop screen, his phone buzzing constantly with messages from former colleagues, journalists, and strangers, all wanting to hear his perspective. After 3 years of isolation and doubt, of being portrayed as disgruntled and unreliable, the sudden validation left him stunned, unable to fully process the rapid shift from pariah to prophet. His sister called from Ohio, crying, "I knew you were telling the truth. I always believed you." The simple affirmation broke something open inside him, tears streaming down his face as the emotional weight of his long ordeal finally found release in Washington, D.C. Staffers at the DOJ were already pulling files related to ArrowTech, preparing briefings for senior officials who would decide whether to open a formal criminal investigation. Regulatory agencies began internal reviews of ArrowTech's previous safety submissions, looking for discrepancies or omissions that might indicate a pattern of deception. At the Securities and Exchange Commission, analysts flagged suspicious trading patterns in ArrowTech stock in the weeks before the hearing, raising questions about potential insider trading. The ripples continued to spread, touching institutions and individuals far beyond the original case. 12 families whose loved ones had been injured by the same product defect Richardson had identified watched the news with growing hope and anger. Their own lawsuits, previously dismissed, now suddenly viable again. Their attorneys began filing emergency motions seeking to reopen cases in multiple jurisdictions, citing the new evidence from Judge Harrington's courtroom. Legal commentators appeared on evening news, breaking down the potential consequences in terms the public could understand. This isn't just about one whistleblower or one company's mistakes, a former federal prosecutor explained. This is about corporate accountability and whether our legal system can effectively check the power of companies worth billions. The story cut across political lines, with both conservative and liberal outlets finding aspects that resonated with their audiences. On the right, a narrative of individual courage against corporate corruption. On the left, a tale of regulatory failure and the need for stronger consumer protections. Industry peers distanced themselves from ArrowTech, issuing statements about their own safety protocols and transparency commitments. Stocks across the sector dipping as investors reassessed risk profiles, Judge Harrington's formal order appeared at 7 p.m., published to the court's electronic filing system. Its language direct and unambiguous, ordering the immediate production of all documents related to the safety issues in question and scheduling an evidentiary hearing for the following Monday. More significantly, it detailed the referral to the Department of Justice, citing potential violations of federal law, including obstruction of justice, securities fraud, and perjury. The order concluded with a rare personal statement from the judge himself, acknowledging his earlier dismissal of the claims and expressing profound concern about the evidence subsequently presented. "The judicial system functions on truth," he wrote. "A court can only render justice when all parties fulfill their obligation to deal honestly and transparently. Failures in this sacred trust undermine not just individual cases, but public confidence in our institutions." Legal observers noted the extraordinary nature of such a statement from a federal judge, particularly one with Harrington's conservative reputation. "This isn't just a legal reversal," a judicial ethics expert commented. "This is a judge publicly acknowledging that the system nearly failed and signaling his determination to correct that failure." As midnight approached, the full scope of the day's events continued to unfold in unexpected ways. Aerotech's board of directors announced an emergency meeting for the following morning, with sources suggesting they would discuss not if but when Thornton would step down. Class action attorneys in 6 states began preparing filings representing shareholders, alleging executives had knowingly misled investors about product safety and legal exposure. Former employees, emboldened by Richardson's vindication, started reaching out to regulators and journalists with their own stories of corners cut, warnings ignored, safeguards overridden. In her downtown apartment, Pam Bondi finally allowed herself a moment to absorb the magnitude of what had transpired. She stood by the window looking out at the city lights below, a glass of rarely indulged whiskey in hand, reflecting on the day's unexpected turn. For 28 years, she had fought these battles, sometimes winning, sometimes losing, but always believing that eventually truth could prevail against even the most powerful adversaries. Today had affirmed that belief, not through grand gestures or eloquent arguments, but through the simple power of evidence carefully gathered and presented at precisely the right moment. Her phone chimed with a text from Richardson, a simple message that said only, "Thank you for everything." She smiled faintly, typing back, "Get some rest. Tomorrow the real work begins." Because she knew better than most that this victory, though significant, was just the beginning of a longer struggle. The forces they had challenged today would regroup, adapt, and counterattack with resources and determination that few could match. But something fundamental had shifted in that courtroom today. A balance of power had been disrupted, a truth had been acknowledged, and once revealed, could never be fully hidden again.